Very shortly, Americans will be visiting the polls to cast their ballots, if they haven't done so already, to vote for the 47th President of the United States. Whilst we will refrain from taking a position, it is abundantly clear that one of the biggest issues in this election is immigration.
So that's why immigration is such a
but immigration and border control
confirms that more than 13,000 illegal immigrants
immigration system. I've been clear.
Demonize immigrants, saying they are poison in the blood of our country.
Anybody who has some knowledge of American history will know that basically everyone, bar Native Americans, are the descendants of immigrants. What is less known, however, is the difference between the many waves of immigrants and how differently they were treated. Initially, settlers in what is now known the US are, perhaps unsurprisingly, all of European origin. Indeed, whilst there were some minor settlements by Spanish and French settlers, by the census of 1790, the majority of the population in the United States were of British origin. Most came from England, but a significant portion came from the rest of the British Isles. Elsewise, there was little immigration during this period from 1790 to the early 1800s. However, it should be noted that the slave trade occurred throughout this period of time, and whilst they weren't counted as immigrants at the time, they would eventually be recognized as American citizens. Currently, African Americans form the third largest ethnic group at around 12% of the American population, mostly in the south of America. The latter part of the 19th century and the early 20th century represented a huge wave of migration into the United States. Around 5 million German migrants, 3.5 million British, and 4.5 million Irish migrants entered the US, with millions more from other countries.
At Ellis Island, America's primary immigration gateway for over 60 years. From 1892 to 1954, over 12 million immigrants walked through those doors and were processed as they entered America.
These European migrants predominantly came from Europe to the East Coast, given the main method of transportation remained by ship. These migrants would contribute towards local culture, and the famous Italian-American culture in New York is a product of this era's immigration.
In the New World, they made their mark, in art and fashion, in music and film, weaving an essential thread into the American tapestry, perhaps nowhere more so than in the realm of food. Pizza, spaghetti and meatballs, baked ziti, chicken parm. Over 15.7 million people in the US identify as Italian Americans, and an even larger number regard Italian food as their comfort food.
Simultaneously, a significant portion of Asian immigrants came to Hawaii and the West Coast. Many came from China, which was at the time suffering from a series of issues inflicted by the Opium Wars. These immigrants, who were severely discriminated against, often worked hard manual labour jobs and were first recruited to work on the railway. They were treated harshly by their employers and the local population, with one senator describing them as automatic engines of flesh and blood. This was before the Chinese Exclusion Act was passed. This was passed in 1882 and, as the name suggests, effective at excluding Chinese migrants. Soon after, though, migrants from Japan and the Philippines began to replace the Chinese migrants in some low-skilled jobs. This act was not fully repealed until the 1965 Immigration Act, signed into law by President Lyndon Johnson.
Mr. Vice President, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Ambassador Goldberg, distinguished members of the leadership of the Congress, distinguished governors and mayors, my fellow countrymen. We have called the Congress here this afternoon not only to mark a very historic occasion, but to settle a very old issue that is in dispute.
This essentially got rid of the previous immigration formula, which focused on preserving America's then ethnic composition by encouraging immigration from Northern Europeans and discriminating against Southern Europeans and Asians. The current immigration system was broadly more generous, allowing many European migrants to join their families. It also kickstarted a new wave of immigration from Asian countries like China, who previously had very low quotas of number of people that the US would let in. These measures have caused a demographic shift in the American population. And this brings us nicely to the current issue facing the American immigration system. For the past few years, there has been an influx of illegal border crossings into the US. This is because people from countries affected by war, corruption, and natural disasters wish to seek asylum in the US. Asylum is a process where somebody fleeing from their country due to unsafe conditions, be it war or political violence, is given protection in another state and allowed to work there. Crucially, in order to seek asylum in the US, you must be in the United States itself.
I don't really understand this last clause that you just said. Like, why does this exist? You're encouraging people to go onto US soil just to get mad at the issue of migration. Like, that's just stupid. I don't understand why this exists.
That is absolutely a valid point you raised. And actually, there are some measures that American lawmakers have tried to make this process a bit more sensible. For example, they've released an app where you can book an appointment to seek asylum. So effectively, you would only then cross the border illegally if you got an appointment. Now, the problem with this system is that essentially supply and demand is imbalanced. So there's a huge demand for these appointments because many people want to enter America to seek asylum, but there aren't enough appointments available on the app. So what people have done up to this summer really was just to cross anyways, because once you cross the border, you would essentially be released and you would be able to work after a couple of months. The current issue is not everybody crossing the border is actually eligible for asylum, and border officials, as we previously described, are under-resourced and for the longest while were instructed to let anyone crossing the border in. Recently, however, this has somewhat changed with stricter rules on who can be let in at the border. Frankly, it just baffles me why this wasn't implemented in the previous couple of years, where illegal immigration numbers have skyrocketed. This has contributed towards the fact that there are nearly 12 million undocumented immigrants currently living in the US. Now, we will point out that one of the political candidates running in this election has suggested that there are actually much more undocumented immigrants, but I do not see any evidence suggesting so we're running with 12 for now. Now, this has caused a number of issues, including worker exploitation, where because of the fact that these migrants are undocumented, they can be paid below minimum wage, subject to harsh labour conditions, and they also don't pay tax. It also leads to overcrowding in certain areas, and Republicans have essentially shipped off immigrants to the democratic cities because of the disagreement in border policy. And also there has been racism instigated by local people, not only to migrant communities, but also to local minority communities who are already existing residents. The rhetoric in this election cycle, though, has further sowed division in communities, reaching a peak during the presidential election where former President Trump claimed Haitian immigrants in Springfield, Ohio, were eating cats and dogs.
In Springfield, they're eating the dogs, the people that came in, they're eating the cats, they're eating the pets of the people that live there. And this is what's happening in our country.
Widely reported to be false after the fact, it shined a light on the divisiveness of this issue and the real issues people are facing in certain areas due to an influx of immigrants.
I don't want to get into politics, but I think the biggest issue we're seeing with this election is the divisive nature, where lots of people who support one party think that the world's going to end if the other party gets elected, and so on. And in fact, Quan, you may have seen Zach from Jerry Rig Everything released a video, I think it was yesterday or 2 days ago, where he essentially communicated the same narrative, which is that if one candidate is picked over the other one, then America will be a completely different place and the world will change after a few years. And I think that's just a bit too extreme. I think we're seeing people being pushed to the extremes and not realizing that a government is formed of thousands of people. And whilst the very, very top in power are elected and the people we choose, there are still so many other people and so many other checks and balances that will mean that we're not going to enter a completely radically different world if we choose a different candidate versus this candidate. Thank you for listening. If you've enjoyed this story, smash those like and subscribe buttons. The full episode can be found in the description alongside our weekly newsletter and the sources that we used. Bye.